Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar on climate change. I appreciate you guys all registering and good to see some high numbers in terms of the attendance. Obviously, this is an emerging part of our industry, so glad to have a good variety of people attend. What I'll do is I'll give you guys a bit of an introduction into the webinar and I suppose who I am and our presenter, of course. And we'll go from there. So my name is John Mathios. I'll be facilitating the webinar today, and David Moret from our office will be our presenter, and he'll also be supported by our two panellists who are well-known people in our industry and highly respected individuals in this space. We've got Warwick Bishop from Water Technology, who's a director and sits on the board there, as well as Luke Cunningham, Director of Rain Consulting. So Warwick and Luke will be our two panellists. They'll be involved a little bit later on when we talk to the Q&A session. I suppose before I get sort of stuck into the introduction and hand over to David, I thought it'd be best to give everyone a bit of an introduction about us and who we are. So most of the people on this call have probably dealt with DPM Consulting Group in one facet or another, but for what it's worth, we're land development engineers and we work across all facets of the land development space. So we operate in the greenfield corridors, brownfield space, and regional Victoria as well. And we deal with all sectors of the land development industry. So residential, industrial and commercial land development is where we play, and that's our sort of space. As a business, we've been around for a long time. We've been around for almost 40 years now. And I suppose a good segue into David Moret's team is our water resources team. So we've got a dedicated in-house water resources management team, which is a group of really passionate and excited engineers that love talking about water resources and stormwater. And I always enjoy listening to them and hearing what they have to say. And that team's led by David. And this is one of our first webinars, so I'm really proud that David's put this sort of presentation together and giving us sort of his insights on climate change, which is really exciting. And I'm keen to learn more about it and hear from it. So I won't take up too much more time with respect to the introduction. I'll just move on to some general housekeeping items. So with respect to questions, you're most welcome to provide questions during the webinar. Just pop them in the chat, and what we'll do is once we get to the Q&A session at the end, we'll just field those accordingly and we'll try and work through all of those. And during the Q&A process as well, if you do have any questions, you're most welcome just to raise your hand using the emoji, and we can even deal with it through voice through there. So that's generally how today's session will run. I look forward to hearing what David has to say, and I also look forward to talking to our panelists during the Q&A session as well. So without further ado, I just want to hand it over to David and let him talk to us about the 7 key climate change insights into land development. So David, I'll hand it over to you, mate, and let you get started.
So thanks everybody for being here today. And thanks, John, for the great introduction. I think you just forgot to mention that both Warwick and I are 6'10" or higher, or taller. Jokes aside, so Tom, if you can go to the next slide. Okay. So climate change, I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of it in some shape or form. It's become a very hot topic. We can read of it in the news, in newspaper, you can see on LinkedIn, in social media. But climate change isn't just a global issue. It's a local challenge, and this challenge directly impacts how we develop land. So what is climate change? By definition, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature, weather patterns, and environmental conditions on Earth. These changes are driven primarily by human activities such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and industrial processes. which increase essentially greenhouse gases concentration in the atmosphere. So what is the result? More flooding, more storms, and more heat waves. And why is this of our interest? As professionals working in land development in Victoria, we have a responsibility to create communities that are not only livable, but also resilient. This means that the way we plan, design, and construct must evolve. Ignoring climate risks is no longer an option. Integrating climate smart strategies into land development isn't just good practice. It's essential for safeguarding people, assets, and long-term sustainability. So we said that climate change isn't just a global issue. It's affecting Australia right now, and that has major implications for land development. But if we look at essentially what's happening in the country, we've been observing rising temperatures across the country with an average of 1.51 degrees since 1910. This leads to more extreme heat events. We've been seeing changing rainfall patterns. Part of Australia becoming drier, part of Australia becoming wetter. We've been seeing higher fire risks. Oceans and coasts are under pressure because we've been observing sea level rise. This means that we must design with climate resilience in mind, adapting our strategies to address heat, water availability, fire risks, and coastal impacts. Ignoring these changes is not an option anymore. So today, we focus on 7 key climate change insights that are fundamentally shaping the future of land development. These insights are crucial for professionals who want to stay ahead of the curve in a time when climate impacts, sustainability, and regulatory changes are increasingly influencing how we design and how we build. The aim and the purpose is to navigate the challenges and seize the opportunities in this new climate conscious landscape. So let's begin with the first insight. So this image shows the devastating flooding that struck Lismore in New South Wales in February 2022, if I remember correctly. So the flood waters in that instance reached a peak of 14.6 meters, which was essentially 2 meters higher than the previous record. People lost their lives, around 6,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. But this is just one example of how climate change is intensifying flood risks and reshaping the landscape in vulnerable areas. In response to such events and to ensure the long-term viability and resilience and safety of our built environments, development strategies must evolve. Key considerations might include smarter land use planning, for instance, incorporating flood-prone zones into open space networks, climate responsive design, using materials, building techniques, and layouts that enhance resilience while maintaining aesthetic and market appeal, integrated stormwater management, and community and industry collaboration. So we need to engage with councils, engineers, and planners early, ensuring that developments align with future-ready policies. Why should we act now then? Future planning controls and building codes will increasingly favor climate adaptation. Being ahead of this curve mitigates compliance risks. Buyers and investors are prioritizing nowadays sustainability and resilience, making future-proof developments more desirable. And finally, integrating resilience from the outset is more cost-effective compared to reactive upgrades or damage recovery post-disaster. As industry professionals, we must advocate for forward-thinking planning policies and resilient design to mitigate future risks. So this is a picture of, sorry, the previous one, Tom. Yeah, perfect. So this is a picture of a railroad bridge between South Dakota and Iowa in the United States. This bridge collapsed due to flooding, and this has caused and will likely cause repercussions for months, as this bridge was a crucial link for transporting commodities. So climate change exacerbates the vulnerability for infrastructure due to extreme weather events. So we must invest in infrastructure design that can withstand extreme weather events. One key solution is flood-resistant engineering, which includes, for instance, elevating critical infrastructure above projected flood levels. Heat-adapted construction is equally important, using heat-resistant concrete, asphalt, expansion joints. And in addition, early warning and risk management systems can provide real-time monitoring of infrastructure and climate hazard, allowing for proactive maintenance and emerging response planning. So by integrating these strategies, we can build infrastructure that is not only stronger, but also more adaptive to a changing climate, protecting communities, safeguarding the economy, and ensuring a sustainable future for the country. Going to our third key insight, we are talking about increased risk management. So climate change introduces new and evolving risks for land development projects, including sea level rise, erosion, and soil degradation, amongst the others. These risks have the potential to impact the viability and sustainability of development projects, making it essential for developers and professionals to implement comprehensive risk management strategies. To ensure long-term success and safety of projects, we must identify and assess risks, develop mitigation plans, and consider adaptation strategies. So continuously reassessing and adjusting risk management plans as climate patterns evolve and new data becomes available. The cost of inaction is way greater than the cost of preparation. To give an example, it's being estimated that without effective climate policies, Australia property market could see a de-evaluation of 571 billion by 2030 due to extreme weather events. So this is pretty powerful, and by taking a proactive approach, as professionals, we can protect investments and reduce long-term maintenance costs, build a climate resilient communities that are safe, functional, and sustainable, and contribute to a stronger, more adaptable Victoria and Australia that thrives despite climate changes. This is not just about mitigating risks. It's about shaping a future where land development is smarter, more responsible, and future-proof. This image illustrates the rising temperature across Australia since 1910. So the 1.5 degrees we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation. As we discussed earlier, these temperature shifts are not only contributing to warmer conditions, but also altering rainfall patterns, leading to increased water scarcity in many regions, including Victoria. So these changes are having a direct impact on the availability of water resources for land development. In response to it, we must prioritize sustainable water management practices to mitigate the effects of changing water availability and minimize environmental impact. Key strategies might include rainwater harvesting, efficient irrigation systems, and water-sensitive urban design. So, for example, integrating natural drainage, wetlands, and permeable surfaces to enhance water retention and decrease runoff. Failing to address water resource challenges can lead to increased costs, project delays, and reduced property value. By prioritizing sustainable water management, developers can safeguard their investments while ensuring long-term environmental and economic viability. Sorry, Tom, just a step back. Investing in eco-friendly infrastructure, such as apartments that might have a Green Star certification, can lead to substantial savings. While the initial cost might increase by about 1.2, 1.3% for, say, a 900,000 apartment, these practices might bring over some savings in the order of 100, 110,000 over 30 years through reduced energy bills, discounted home loans, and increased property value. Now we're going to the next key insight about climate change for land development, and this is represented by biodiversity preservation. So human activities, as we saw at the beginning, such as burning fossil fuels and deforestation, release significant amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Half of these emissions remain in the air, and half of them get absorbed by land and ocean ecosystems, essentially acting as natural carbon sinks. Sustainable development must prioritize habitat restoration, green corridors, and wildlife-friendly landscaping. Biodiversity conservation and climate resilience are not just environmental concerns. They are essential for long-term project success. And the reason I'm saying that is because we need to consider regulatory and planning compliance with environmental laws requiring biodiversity impact assessment and mitigation. No compliance can result in project delays, additional costs, and legal challenges. We also need to pay consideration to climate resilience and risk management, with damaged ecosystem increasing flood risks and soil instability and the urban heat effect, which we're going to see in the next slide. And we're going to have consideration on the market demand and economic value. Buyers and investors nowadays prioritize sustainability. Well-planned developments with green spaces decrease maintenance costs and increase property values. And finally, we also need to consider social and community benefits. Green spaces enhance community well-being and attract residents. Biodiversity-focused projects build trust with stakeholders and ease approval processes. Neglecting biodiversity can lead to costly regulatory hurdles, decrease property appeal, and increase environmental risks. Therefore, integrating biodiversity conservation and sustainable design helps developers and professionals decrease financial risks, increase property interest, and ensure the long-term viability in a changing market. Talking about climate change, I'm going to be warmer, so let me have a quick drink. Okay, so urban heat island mitigation. So this image demonstrates a typical urban setup. You can see some trees, gazebo, a street, which this urban setup experience significantly higher temperature compared to rural areas. And this phenomenon is known as the urban heat island effect. Essentially, where built-up areas absorb and retain more heat compared to natural landscapes. And this is due to factors such as dense buildings, concrete, and limited green spaces. Climate change intensifies the urban heat island effect, exacerbating the temperature rise in densely populated areas. This leads to high energy consumption, increased air conditioning use, and also put a strain on the cooling systems. To address these challenges, we can mitigate the urban heat island effect through strategic urban planning. This might include incorporating green spaces, planting trees, creating parks, and designing green rooftops to provide shade and decrease heat absorption, utilizing reflective surfaces, and energy efficient building designs, essentially constructing buildings with better insulation and natural ventilation. By considering these strategies into development plans, we can improve thermal comfort, we can lower energy consumption, and we can avoid high operational costs and increase energy demand, which decrease livability. Last but not least of our 7 key insights today is the adaptation strategies. In response to increasing flood risks due to climate change, elevating structures has become a key adaptation strategy in areas like North Carolina. And there's an example here in this photo. So as climate change continues to escalate flood risks, adaptation is essential for long-term sustainability of land development. We need to integrate climate resilient strategies into projects to ensure both safety and viability in the face of changing conditions. Effective adaptation strategies include flexible designs, so incorporating adjustable foundation or raised platforms that allow for modification as flood risks changes. Disaster-resistant construction materials, using flood-resistant materials like elevated steel or water-resistant finishes. And that is to protect structures from water damage. And finally, community engagement. Collaborating with local communities to create flood preparedness plans, raise awareness, and ensure that residents and businesses are ready for extreme weather events. By embedding these adaptive measures into development projects, we can help future-proof our communities and ensure the sustainability of developments in the face of evolving climate risks. We have now explored the 7 key climate change insights shaping the future of land development. These insights, ranging from the importance of using more resilient materials to the need for adaptive land use planning, highlight the critical steps needed to address climate change challenges head-on. As we move forward, it's clear that while climate change presents significant challenges, it also offers an opportunity. An opportunity to build a future where communities are resilient, the natural environment is protected, and land development benefits for both people and the planet. Addressing these challenges requires a strategic and science-driven approach. Expertise in hydrology, flood risk assessment, stormwater management, climate resilience planning play a crucial role in developing industry-leading solutions that help navigate the evolving landscape of sustainable development. By integrating climate consideration into land use planning, projects can not only meet current regulations, but also be future-proofed against climate change conditions. Through adaptive land use strategies, proactive climate risk management, and biodiversity preservation, it's possible to create thriving communities that withstand environmental challenges. But achieving this vision requires collaboration, innovation, and a commitment to forward-thinking solutions. Sustainability isn't just about protecting the planet. It's about protecting our projects, profits, and future viability. Together, we can shape a more resilient and sustainable Victoria and Australia, ensuring the projects are designed to withstand climate challenges, align with regulatory requirements, and contribute to a more sustainable future. Now, if you have any questions or need support with your development or climate change planning issues or questions, feel free to reach out to me or the DPM office, and I will be more than happy to assist and work together towards a sustainable solutions. Now, back to you, John, for the panel discussion.
Well done, David. Really appreciate that. Well spoken. So what we'll do now, guys, I haven't really paid attention to the chat just to see if any questions have been dropped in there, but there haven't been, but that's okay. We've prepared some questions thinking that this might pop up anyway. So just to moderate the panel discussion, I've got a couple of questions that I've got handy here that I'll reach out, and Warwick and Luke, I'll let you guys decide how you want to answer these. I'll let you sort of pick which ones you want to answer. But as I mentioned, please feel free to put up your hand if you're in the audience, just to raise your hand and ask any questions, or like I said, pop them in the chat and go from there. So one thing that we've got here from our list of questions, I suppose, is there one particular critical policy or action that you think the industry needs to have implemented immediately with respect to climate change? Happy to take answers from both of you, or if one's got something at the top of their mind, but if there's one policy or action do you think there's something that we should be looking at adopting straight away? And yeah, look, you can treat that in a national sense or a Victorian sense, I suppose.
Would you like to go first, Warwick, or I'll jump in?
I know. You go.
All right. So, hey everyone. I think one of the science behind climate change is really, really well founded now. So there's high probabilities that we're going to have the increased rainfalls, very, very high probabilities on the increased sea levels, those sorts of things. So we know a lot about it now. We need to take into account the life cycle of our developments and the assets that we're building as well. And that needs to be supported by policy, I think. So we do need leadership here to, put some clear guidance out at the moment around, what sort of levels we should be designing to, so we can get it right with the best available information we've got right now, and be able to incorporate that. There's, I think, through obviously one of the big mechanisms is through the planning scheme, and Warwick and I were both involved in the C384 amendment in the City of Melbourne. It only got introduced late last year, but that one includes climate change within it. So it's got 2100 climate in it. So any new buildings in the CBD and various other parts of Melbourne are now being designed to a climate change level, which I think is great. They're the older climate change levels, but it's a fantastic start. And I think that's a really good example there that the science may change over time, absolutely, but it's not an excuse to sort of have our heads in the sand about it. Do you have anything you want to add there, Warwick?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I totally agree. I think the challenge really is one around planning and policies and regulatory frameworks as being the key driver of adaptation and resilience for the community, because from a technological point of view, I think we've got a lot of the tools and the processes and the toolkit of the measures that we need to develop a more sustainable urban environment. But it's really is the political will and the regulatory framework there to back that up. I think one of the challenges at the moment is that in the planning sphere, there's really no climate change specific instruments within the planning scheme, and that what we're finding is that existing legacy tools are being used and sort of massaged in order to try and accommodate this overlay of future risk related to climate change. And the classic example then, as you mentioned, Luke, is in the flood overlay space, that we're using flood overlays that officially really are meant to represent the existing 1% AEP flood risk, but they're being asked to do some extra work in terms of taking into account future risk. And then the adjusted overlays that reflect future climate change are being applied for current day planning applications without perhaps the nuance that sort of really requires. And so I think if I could sort of wave a magic wand and something change within the planning scheme as it stands, the introduction of a specific sort of climate change risk overlay or some sort of measure that isolates the actual risk associated with climate change separate to or in parallel with, if you like, the existing overlay of flood risk, for example, associated with current climate conditions. And I know that's something that's been contemplated by the planning department and government over probably the last 10 years, but change in that planning space is very difficult to bring about, and so it's taken time, but I'm sure we'll get there.
Yeah. And sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, John. I was just going to add there as well, just as a addendum to the City of Melbourne stuff. We worked a lot with the City of Melbourne in preparation for that planning scheme amendment, and we did a lot of, you're thinking through worst case scenarios. What's the community going to think? Those sorts of things. And one of the risks that was brought up was climate change. And, as Warwick said there, we're using this mechanism which is meant to represent the existing 1% flood, and we're saying, but here's a little bit more on top, here's climate change on top. And we thought, are people going to push back? there was a little bit, but the overwhelming response, which wasn't expected necessarily, was that the community were happy that climate change had been addressed here, and that council was doing something about it and planning for it. So that was something that did take us a little bit by surprise from a social perspective there.
Yeah, just wanted to add as well that the challenge that we have nowadays is you're looking at your planning scheme, and that's based on historical data. So you had an overlay that might not reflect what actually is happening nowadays, and it doesn't reflect climate change either. So as an industry, we approach the planning scheme and we look at the overlays that are sitting there, but we know that they might not actually be realistic, or they're just based on historical data, and these need to change based on the current information we have and all the data that we have about climate change. In my mind, the issue I have is the planning scheme going to be able to catch up quickly, or as quick as the climate change data is going to evolve, and how we're going to get more information? That's probably the main issue that I have in my mind nowadays.
Yeah. Look, it's very dynamic. I suppose even from just my perspective, what I've seen with respect to climate change specifically, obviously there was the Act that came out in 2017. Then there was Victoria's climate change strategy that got issued after that, which really focused on emissions. But what we are seeing, I suppose, implemented from a planning scheme perspective is by the LPPs, so the local planning provisions. Some councils have started introducing clauses for climate change. I think it's under clause 13. But the language in those clauses tends to be, I suppose, quite fluffy, if you like. I'm trying to find a better word, but it's not very explicit, which I think draws back to your points, Warwick and Luke, about, dealing with that. And I suppose the dynamic nature of climate change with the ever-evolving requirements. Are we going to be able to change planning schemes quickly enough to match that? But look, certainly there's some good questions there, and our panelists have asked, our audience has asked some great questions, and I just want to put them through. One that came in, which is really good. Are there any panelists? Are any of the panelists seeing any movement with councils starting to talk about climate change consideration in stormwater detention sizing? So I suppose that's more of a question if you had any experiences like that in your sort of professional environment dealing with councils on detention sizing.
Might start here, then I'll let you go, Warwick and Luke. Yeah, we probably more than council, catchment authority are starting to ask the question in terms of drainage scheme asset design, and they're starting to ask the question whether we're considering climate change in the medium term, long term, and what kind of scenario we're looking at. So the question is starting to pop up, but we're going back to the previous topic that there's not really a guideline to saying that's the way to do it. Climate change is very broad, as you mentioned before, John. In the planning scheme, there's clause 13 referred to climate change considerations, which doesn't really provide any details on how, as professional, we need to approach that. So the question is starting to pop up from catchment authorities, probably even councils soon. But again, the difficulties and the challenge that we have here is we can consider it, but how do we consider it? Are we looking at 2100? Are we looking at 2050? What's the life of the structure we're looking at? So that there's a lot of moving parts, and as you mentioned before, John, is a very dynamic space. So as I mentioned in my presentation, I reckon collaboration is the way to go. As industry, as professionals, we need to make sure that we go in the same direction. We don't necessarily need to have the same answer, but it has to be close enough for everybody involved to approach the same problem with the same answer.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, David, and definitely, and as John raised, the issue I think with those climate change provisions in the planning scheme, it's a bit like IWM. It's in the same bucket. It's talked about in a very broad general sense, but there's no real there's no real teeth in those provisions within the planning scheme to enforce those provisions. And so the example I like to use is in the stormwater quality space, you've got BPM targets that have been in the planning scheme for 20 years, and they're really fixed hard targets that you have to demonstrate you achieve that level of performance. It's a bit like a 1% AP flood height, for example. At the end of the day, you've got to put a number on something if you really want to drive that change, and that's what's missing in relation to broadly climate change and IWM within the planning scheme. And those two, they're kind of interrelated. So I think that's a really key point. The other one, and the point I wanted to make earlier, is that I just remembered, is that one of the issues I see with the planning system, it really only deals with new or redevelopment. And you think about vulnerable communities in relation to flooding or climate change, coastal hazard risk and so on. It's the residual risk associated with all the existing urban environment that's really the bulk of the problem. And I think in some respects, simply applying these principles to just to new development or redevelopment in brownfield areas is going to incrementally improve the resilience of the community, but it's not going to be a step change until we come up with schemes that actually have a broader impact across all that residual development. So I think in answer to Julian's question, I'd agree with the others that it's a bit piecemeal at the moment and lacking probably ultimately some really clear direction from state government to, rather than leaving it to individual councils through LP local planning provisions, there should be state planning provisions really that I think provide some consistency.
Very good, very good. I'm seeing some good questions here about feasibility and viability of how this is going to impact the land development industry. And I think they're all very valid questions. So I'm just going to pick one here, which I suppose captures most of the questions that have been asked in regard to that. How can we balance sustainable design, so climate change considerations, with project costs? Raising design standards often leads to increased investment. So how can we achieve sustainability while maintaining financial feasibility? So that's always the question that comes up with these sorts of things, and I think it's very valid. I've got maybe a couple of ideas, but I'll hand it to you guys first, and I could probably add some finishing touches if you like.
Yeah, it's incredibly tricky for a number of reasons. I believe it's, when we're in the land development space, we're designing and building and paying for the assets with a prescribed level of service, which is today's level of service generally. And we do know that that level of service is going to decline with climate change. So we're going to see poorer performance out of our assets. As a developer will look after an asset for however many years they're required to, then it gets handed over to councils or Melbourne Water or equivalent. And that cost of ongoing upgrades or the cost of additional flooding in the future, those sorts of things, who pays for that? Is it that there's arguments there that if the developers are paying up front now, the cost of climate change is ultimately being put onto the people that are going to be buying the property. We just translate those costs through to property prices. And is that the correct solution? Is this a first home buyer's problem, climate change, or is it a state or is it a federal problem that needs to be funded? And I know there's a lot of discussions there in the drainage scheme area around, do we include climate change? And if we do, who pays for that difference between today's climate and the future climate? If it's going to increase a retarding basin size by whatever percentage, who pays for that increase in percentage there? And is it fair to have that all come back to the community?
And I think Luke, you're absolutely right. Is what are the flow-on costs as well? You have to consider that instead of the capital costs. Often when these things, I've found when they get introduced into the industry and implemented through planning schemes, there's different ways that the costs are going to be dealt with. And then I suppose one way of looking at it is, well, assessing what we currently do to see how that stacks up against climate change. So for instance, our current streetscapes in land developments, our wetlands, how do they deal with the urban heat island effect? we often assess these assets against a different set of criteria based on what we knew, I suppose. With these emerging criteria, how do they stack up against them? And are there some easy wins there that we're already achieving by default, I suppose, in the first instance? And then the other part of it is, well, what happens when it becomes a level playing field? If, for instance, drainage schemes across Melbourne Water's jurisdiction were to consider climate change, well, then that's obviously going to create a levy rate that's going to apply to all developers, which ultimately translates down to the end user. So it creates that level playing field as well. So whilst there's going to be a cost increase in terms of the competitiveness and financial viability of some projects, everybody's in the same sort of environment. So obviously it's a direct impulse to the end user, which could affect demand, but it's inevitable in the sense that it will affect all in the same sort of capacity. So
I think what we're trying to prevent here is ongoing future costs to whoever's going to be the end user there. And there is discussions out there about sort of market-based solutions as well, where developers may be rewarded for adopting greener development standards through quicker planning approvals or through other altered conditions, or financial incentives for eventual landowners through having water sensitive urban design within their lot scale. So they then get discounts on water bills, or something along those lines, or rates and things like that. There may be other ways here that we can fund some of this change as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I agree with all that, and I think like looking and the whole framework around climate change thinking is you have to have a long-term view, and so life cycle costs, long-term costs to the community and to the individual landowner, they're hard things to build into people's short-term decision making, and when people see a short-term increase in cost versus avoiding a cost 20 or 30 years down the track, it's hard to for people to reconcile that. I guess it sits within the broader question around affordability, which is, it's a big question anyway, whether you include climate change impacts or not. And so that's ultimately a community sort of challenge, if you like, and a political challenge in terms of how do you balance that out, whether it's land availability, rates of immigration. It's a pretty big topic. And so, I think it's just about putting it in context.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think a lot of those questions that have popped up in the chat there, I've been answered quite well. Certainly with respect to, I think one of the questions was there about educating the public to accept those costs. I think what you spoke to earlier, Luke, about how that's transferred to the end user and whether there's any potential offset schemes to incentivize them is certainly a good mechanism for doing that.
There's a really good article on the ABC news website yesterday. It was called, I've just got it on my phone here, "The insurance industry calls for $30 billion flood defence fund as fees cripple households." And there's one section here that it says, "A new analysis of the National Flood Information Database performed by the Insurance Council has found that those at the highest risk of flooding tend to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. To put it simply, it's more affordable to buy a house in a floodplain, but the cost of insuring is almost impossible." So it's sort of already talking to that sort of issue there, that we do have a housing crisis and the cost of living going up and cost of development going up. How's this all going to translate?
And that's an historical issue. Of course, usually affordability is an important topic. And as you mentioned, look, a lot of times we see that people that are buying houses on the floodplain are people that are not, in that category, they're not rich people, put it simply. So they're going to be the one affected. So if you present to them a solution, say, hey, you're going to pay double the price because you're going to need to consider climate change, it's not going to sell well. So we are missing that mechanism, and it has to come political perspective of how do we incentivize, I know you guys touched before on this, how do we incentivize the fact that we're not only looking at today, we're looking at 100 years horizon, possibly 50 years horizon. How do we incentivize the fact that we need to look ahead and we need to look into the future, how these costs are going to be passed on, or if they're going to be passed on, and how do we manage that? So it's I don't think there's a real answer nowadays, and it's going to be a difficult answer, a difficult topic to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good reference point, Luke, around the media and what's been publicised. There was something else I read recently, which I think was critical of the state government and it's a bit of a political jibe probably, but the fact that Victoria hasn't necessarily invested or taken advantage of federal funds to invest in resilient buildings, for example, flood resilient buildings. And so there's been a Build Back Better fund, I think, in Queensland, New South Wales, following the 2022 floods there. And Victoria's sort of approach is, we want to use the planning scheme to deal with things in that respect. But I think that's quite, as I said before, it's quite a narrow approach in the sense that it's only going to capture a small portion of the total market. And if you can incentivize people with subsidies or access to funds to raise their floors or to use more flood resistant materials, given that we know people are going to continue to live in the floodplain, it's simply not feasible to relocate everyone who's affected by flood risk. So I think those sorts of investments, absolutely, and that's the sort of thing the Insurance Council, I'm sure, would be looking for. Let's just increase the resilience of the community to a risk that we know is going to happen, and that at the moment they're just not really well prepared for. And the definition of madness is to keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. And just rebuilding houses in a floodplain, without taking those measures is crazy. But it's also crazy to let people continue to live in an area, or not just let them, but people who live in an area with known flood risk. We should give them the opportunity to improve their resilience.
I think, yeah, it's really good work. I think there's really good parallels as well to bushfire management, and how that's been. Firstly, there's the whole education side of bushfire management, and one of the, I guess, advantages that bushfire has is it's got a definite season. We sort of know when bushfire season's coming. We do have a flood season, but it's not as predictable.
It's all year, isn't it? Flood season.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the bell ratings on houses and things like that. But we've even seen through that people's houses burn down, they get their insurance money back, and they can't afford to replace it with the new required guidelines with the bell ratings. And even that's such a tricky conversation as well. People do want to live in these areas still, and they want to remain part of their communities and those sorts of things, but can't afford to rebuild with the new planning policies that are required there. So it's I think it's a good step it's a step in the right direction in that regard, but there's still some big challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some food for thought there. I thought, obviously for the audience, everybody, you're obviously most welcome to unmute your microphone and ask some questions. We've just had a good question come in from Jessica Ward. So it's about adaptive strategies. So can we talk more about adaptive strategies and how we might, as an industry, guide authorities best in building the business case for climate smart design? So good question there. Challenging question, I must say. How do we feel about that? What can we offer in that regard?
Well, I think and Luke touched on this before, it's about education, I suppose, and opening up the dialogue around what the opportunities are and what the pathways towards resilience and adaptation might be. And that's really where I think the rubber hits the road with this stuff, because we know the measures that we can take to move towards a more resilient future. It's sort of, what are those pathways in order to get there? And the point was raised earlier about the costs of and that's a real issue, but it's also a perception around, well, that we're just making things more expensive. But it's a bit like putting solar panels on your house. It might cost more, but you're going to save money over time. And the same thing could be said for high levels of insulation or shading and landscaping, things that there might be an upfront cost, but a payback over an extended period of time. And I think it's around continuing to engage with authorities and have dialogue and explain these things and sell the benefits and try and move forward in a collective sense, which I think is something that David brought up right during his presentation. The parallel for me is probably something in, say, the IWM space where there's been, there's no one authority that takes responsibility for integrated water management. It's been a case of collaboration across the industry with the forums and so on to move that forward. And people might argue that has been successful or not as successful, depending on your point of view, but it's certainly moving in the right direction. I think with something as complex as climate change and climate change adaptation, the way forward is just through continual collaboration and education to bring people along.
I think education is probably the main item, I'd say, and of course we touch on collaboration, but we need to educate the community and authorities that's the way forward. And when it comes to adaptation, you might see more costs, but you need to build your business case to show that you might save money now, but you're definitely gonna waste your money down the track if that happens. And the percentage, the probability that is gonna happen is becoming higher and higher if you live on a floodplain. The question is not if I'm gonna get flooded, it's when am I gonna get flooded? And we observe based on data that percentage is coming up. So it's not gonna, we're not talking about once in your lifetime, maybe twice, 3, 4 times. So it comes back to educate the public, educate the authorities to say that's what we are moving forward. That's what we need nowadays to withstand what we're gonna be challenged with in the future. So we need to sell as industry professionals that that's the way to approach this topic. But definitely a good question, and again, it's definitely a challenge again as climate changes.
Yeah.
But very quickly, if I can, Johnny, completely agree. It's a life cycle cost thing. Another thing I think that can be explored, and it relates back to the planning question earlier, as well as allowing multiple uses of properties, and particularly as we see, we're going to see more and more the flood depths go up and up and up, and we don't want to be walking around cities where we have to walk up flights of stairs, or buildings need to be accessible as well, all those sorts of things. So can we use combine zoning codes to have areas that are we know we're going to get flooded, which aren't dwellings though, that we use for public open spaces or gathering places, cafes, things like that, which are a lower risk than a habitable space as well. So that's an area where I think we can challenge our authorities a little bit as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, it sounds like more forums like these and really collaborating and educating with authorities will be central to that. And I suppose it's also going to come down to reciprocation from the authority as well. It's the fear of the unknown. You have to sort of be open to taking on board these new and innovative type developments and projects as well from an authority's position. That also needs to come from them as the ultimate asset owner.
Yeah, Johnny, something related to that. I might just make a point that I think, and we see this, and everyone would probably be very well aware of in the planning space where, for example, there might be an individual property that's susceptible to flooding, and the need for a flood response management plan at the individual development level, and there might be a whole series of these in the same street, for example. And I think in that scenario, there's really a role for authorities, whether it's councils or Melbourne Water or SES or some sort of collective responsibility to develop more sort of community or precinct-based responses to flood risk, because the way it is at the moment, it's just very piecemeal lot by lot, development by development, it's really not an efficient or effective way to address community resilience. And obviously with climate change, it just compounds that. It's an issue under existing conditions, let alone future conditions. So I think those sorts of approaches in terms of community resilience, there needs to be more of a coordinated approach, I would say.
Yeah, very good. Well, the Oscar music's coming on. I'm being told that we only have a couple of minutes left in today's webinar. So with that, what I'll do is I'll wrap it up, and I want to obviously thank our panelists for making time out of their busy schedule for being with us here today, and also David for his efforts in putting this together and presenting his first webinar today. So congratulations to him on that. This webinar will be available on our YouTube page, so you're most welcome to go on there and have a look and like, share, and subscribe and do all that kind of stuff. I probably should just give the audience just a bit more insight about our webinars. We're looking at doing a few more of these throughout the year, and also drilling down on some more really sort of in-depth and detailed issues of the industry. One that we're looking into is to interim stormwater management and temporary solutions, which is a very hot topic of the land development industry. So that's something that David and I will be working on, and I suppose watch this space for that webinar. That's something that I think will gauge a lot of interest from the industry, being a very hot topic. So with that, I'm sure we can all share our contact details if you have any more questions, and you can always reach out to us and talk about this in further detail. And yeah, thank you everybody for making the time. We appreciate it. And I think with that, I'm just about one o'clock, so that should bring us to a close.